Welcome back to Unveiling the Covenants, where we explore the mysteries of sacred scripture and the covenant love of God the Father from the heart of the church. My name is Marcus Peter, your regular host. We're going to continue our journey of exploring each book of the Bible, and today we'll be looking at the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy in Hebrew, well, first of all, let's talk about the name Deuteronomy, right? Deuteros and Nomos, the second law. We have to ask ourselves, what second law, what first law was there? Well, first to understand this, we need to go all the way back to the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 20, all the way till about 31, you see Moses go up Mount Sinai to commune with God and to talk to God, and God gives him the tablets of the covenant. And these 12 chapters, these 11 chapters or so, about God giving Moses the covenantal stipulations of his people and what they're called to live by. Prior to Moses going up, the people had sworn that they would honor the Lord and they would honor his covenant. But 40 days of him being atop Sinai, they've already forgotten it. So we all know that in chapter 32 of Exodus, there's this massive event that taints Israel's history and sets them down a journey of completely different liturgical proportions. First of all, we know this to be the golden calf event. And in Hebrew, it actually reads as the sin of the calf. That's how bad it is. Scholars posit that the calf was Apit, a Hebrew idol of livestock. And so, the people were worshipping that which was familiar. The gold that they had given to the making of Apit was gold that had been given to them upon their departure. So the very blessing that they received as a result of God saving them from slavery, they turned and used as an affront against God. It was that terrible. Gets even worse. In chapter 32, we see that what happens is the Israelites are caught naked. The action of worshiping the idol probably ended in wanton sexual acts. It was a perverse event. Moses comes down from the mountain with Joshua, and he sees this, and he breaks the stone tablets, which is a sign, a very grievous sign, but a sign of the covenant has been broken, the covenant has been violated. The people have not honored that which they swore to do. And then there's this whole act of purification, and the Levites rush to Moses' side for not having worshipped the idol, but the rest of Israel is punished for having worshipped the idol. What follows from there after the events in Exodus is, well, we've got the book of Numbers, historical chronology, but Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Leviticus, the entire book of Leviticus, as I've mentioned before, is about the elevation of the elevation of the Levites into the order of the priesthood, into the order of the ministerial Levitical priesthood. Prior to that, the model of the priesthood, as I've mentioned before, was specifically a father-son priesthood. God ordained Adam, Adam ordained his sons, and every single generation, fathers continue to ordain their sons, with one person being selected to be covenant mediator, and in that regard, the kind of high priest over the covenant. So there was one high priest covenant mediator over the community, but there were multiple priests. Every son was made a priest, and so every son in his turn could ordain his sons into priests. The entire nation of Israel was made up of a nation of priests. They were literally a nation of priests. And so when they committed this affront, they had violated not only their covenant fidelity, but their right to the priesthood, which is a gift of allowing them to participate in the sacrifice of liturgical worship that renews their covenant bond with God. They had not only taken that for granted, they had literally affronted it. And so what does God do? He elevates the Levites to an order of ministerial priests. And the entire book of Leviticus is about the long ordination ceremony and the laws, the canon law, if you will, the ritual laws that the Levites will now be held by because of the golden calf incident. Now, because of the golden calf, and because the Levites did not sin in the golden calf incident, they received the right of the priesthood. But the rest of Israel, the other 11 tribes, well, really 10 tribes and 2 half-tribes. Ephraim and Manasseh were the tribe of Joseph, broken down into 2 half-tribes. The other 11 tribes had committed themselves to this heinous act of idolatry. And so they are accused of not just idolatry, but in fact adultery against Yahweh their Lord God and bridegroom. So what happens is God laicizes them. And Deuteronomy becomes this entire long collection of 3 sermons during which Moses presents the second law for the people. The first law had been violated, and so God increases the demand. You get Moses speaking to the people, imposing upon them the Deuteronomos, the second law. The Hebrew name for Deuteronomy is Devarim, and Devarim translates into the words. Why? Because the whole thing is composed of Moses' words. He is preaching to them. It ends in a tone of hope. He prophesies the coming of the prophet. I remember attending a Bible study where someone said, these are the conditions that a prophet, everyone is called to be a prophet, and we need to see if they check these boxes. No. That's a poor interpretation of the text. What was really going on is Moses was talking about the prophet, the grand prophet. Why? Because Moses, up till that point, was known as the greatest prophet in Israel. And he was. He will eventually come to be known as the one who brought the law, and he becomes a symbol of the law. Elijah is then elevated to be known as the greatest prophet. Moses and Elijah become images of Christ and John the Baptist in their rightful place, and we can talk about that in future books. For now, what we want to focus on is that Moses tells them, God will raise unto you a prophet like me, but greater. And this person, this becomes recognized as a messianic prophecy, a prophecy about the Messiah. So the Devarim, the words of Moses, is found in the very first line. These are the words. And from that, scholars believe that this book, if you know our national constitution, if you know our founding documents, you can imagine, especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy, being the founding documents of the nation of Israel. Everything that's stipulated in Leviticus and Deuteronomy from this point on will continue all the way till the time of Jesus and until the destruction of the temple in 71 AD. In fact, if I'm to be very specific, to this day, every single Orthodox and Hasidic Jew, every person who wants to hold to the stipulations of the Torah, are called to uphold the 613 laws found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy to the best of their abilities. A lot of those laws, I want to say maybe almost a third of those laws, are comprised of sacrificial laws, but that cannot happen because the temple has been destroyed. But those laws, according to the minds of Jews, is still in place. I mean, you have to contrast the 613 laws, and then the Pharisaic cult, the Pharisees, they write this book called the Talmud, where they up the number of laws from 613 to well over 1,000. And they just keep adding on to it, interpreting the law and adding more and more stipulations. Eventually, it's not enough that we have burial rights. You have to have burial rights, and you have to have at least 3 music players and 3 mourners, and that's considered a proper burial ceremony. I mean, it really does get ridiculous. There were stipulations in the Babylonian Talmud that say that during the sacrifice, if the smoke goes up and it does not go up straight, if a gust of wind blows the smoke away, Yahweh is not pleased with the sacrifice, and you need to redo it again. But if the smoke goes up all the way straight, then Yahweh is pleased with the sacrifice, and your sacrifice is valid. They just kept heaping on these burdens that were not even in the scriptures. That's tangential to the main part. And the main part is very simply this, that these laws were put in place because God the Father realized that his children needed greater guidance. And let me give you a bad analogy that illustrates this. For those of us who are parents, we tell our children to do good things because we discern and judge that that is what's best for them. No parent, unless their conscience is completely awry, no parent in their right mind looks at a child and says, gosh, I want you to do this bad thing. Go ahead and do it. I want you to damage yourself. No one does that. Unless they're mentally unstable, and I'm fully aware of the world we're living in right now. I'm talking about the general populace. Parents want good things for their children. So when you tell your child, say, don't stick the fork. First of all, don't run around with a fork. But second of all, don't stick the fork in an outlet. And if the child insists on, first of all, grabbing a fork and running around with a fork, well, what winds up happening? Well, I can tell you exactly what happens. Mommy and Daddy purchase locks that can be attached to drawers so that now the silverware is completely untouchable. Why? Because you're not supposed to be running around with the forks to begin with. The initial rule of don't run around with a fork has now been coupled with you are not allowed to open that drawer to begin with. Parents understand that when you have a basic rule that is not being adhered to, more rules need to be added on to reinforce the main rule. That's exactly what God does with the liturgical stipulations of Israel. I'll give you another example. Now, most of my analogies come from the fact that my children at the time of the shooting, one is an infant and one is a toddler, and they're lovely and they're wonderful, and we're just enjoying the joy of being parents and watching them become their own persons and helping curb them in good discipline along the way. So parents of teenagers, parents of older children, grounding is a fairly common punishment that's issued upon children, and punishment is not a bad word. That which is punitive is restorative. We punish that we may restore right order to justice and discipline in the household. So grounding is an extra rule that's imposed upon a child for violation of a pre-existing rule. For example, your curfew is 9 p.m. Get home by 9 p.m. If the child comes home at 10:30 or forbid midnight, well, what happens? 1 month of grounding, no TV, maybe the phone gets taken away, whatever it is. Regardless of the circumstance, extra rules are put in place to reinforce the initial rule. Why? Because there must be order in the household. The same is true of the people of God. The violation at the golden calf incident was such a violation to the order of the household of God that the extra rules were put in place to train the people of God into living rightly within the house of God. That's why even when we take a look at canon law is not there for the church to tell us, don't do this, don't do that. That's such a misinterpretation. God is a loving father. The church is Holy Mother Church, and she is a loving mother. Good parents want good things for their children. Not everyone understands why we ought not to do certain things. And for those situations, especially those of us who are spiritually immature or whatever it is, the church gives us the what's, what ought to do, what we ought to do, what we ought not to do. And as our obligation is then to understand why this is. I've never seen more affront against the church than against her sexual morality teachings, and especially in today's day and age. It's a travesty. It is a complete misrepresentation of how the church truly is. The church is not concerned about, people say stuff like, well, it's no one's business what happens behind closed doors and in my bedroom. No, I'm sorry. But the smallest to the greatest things that we do has a moral effect on ourselves and therefore our families and therefore our societies. Nothing stays behind closed doors. The act of allowing for rampant, unregulated sexual acts begets not only out-of-wedlock pregnancies, it also begets the transmission of diseases. It also begets the breaking of families, especially if it's the sin of adultery and not just fornication. It also begets the reneging of responsibility. I mean, we live today in a cult of fatherlessness that is unlike anything we've ever seen in history. Why? Because sex without consequence. Men don't have to be men. Men are being boys, acting on pleasure and bolting the first chance they get. These rules are there for a reason because they promote human flourishing. The gift of the sexual intercourse of bride and bridegroom is meant to be enshrined in the lifelong commitment of marriage because God knows that is the way to happiness, and that this great gift finds its culmination in the love, the selfless love between bride and bridegroom, and that love is so selfless, so giving, so mutual, so gift-like. It is a self-gift of one to the other that it culminates in a life. That's why it's called procreation and not just reproduction. Animals reproduce. Human beings procreate. We cooperate with our Creator God to bring this immortal person into the world. Because my bride and I said yes to God, Benedict, my son, Therese, my daughter, and our 2 children in heaven, we hope in God's providence that they are in heaven, will eternally exist because of our yes to God and the selflessness of the act of wanting to give of each other to each other. These children come about and they're eternal. Sometimes I just sit and marvel. I stare at my children in wonder at the fact that God used my bride and I to bring this immortal soul into the world. Immortal! I could not have done that. I had nothing to do with putting his soul into him. I had nothing to do with putting Teresa's soul into her. And their personalities, their temperaments, these gifts are results of the laws that God has put in place for biology, chemistry, physics, and nature is built upon by grace. And God imbues these children with immortal souls because of our cooperation in his act. Laws are put in place to promote individual and communal flourishing. This is why violation of these laws brings about death at any different level, whether or not we immediately realize it. The advent of the LGBTQ movement can only be destructive because it is a violation of natural law. And once what violates natural law is a greater affront to divine law that God has revealed to us. Nature tells us men are not meant to have relations with men. The relation goes nowhere. It begets nothing good. It is only done for the sake of pleasure, and therein lies the problem. When human beings live for pleasure, we cease to be human and we start acting like animals. That's exactly what Israel does. Reason that God has given us shows us that he has ordained these laws for the sake of true happiness and human flourishing, not for the sake of temporary pleasure. So when you and I consider these realities that God has given us, when we take a look at, say, the Code of Canon Law and the Church's teachings on sexual morality and sacramental realities, it's not because the Church is stringent and wants to curtail our fun. Gosh, no one has more celebrations than the Catholic Church. No one parties more than the Catholic Church in its truest sense. Take a look at our liturgical calendar. Do you have any idea how many solemnities we have to celebrate and feast on? I mean, we have the entirety of Christmastide and the entirety of Eastertide to celebrate. The church is all about celebration. We literally say we celebrate the sacraments. No, the church wants us to celebrate life. But in order to do so, we ought to take a look at the laws that have been put in place for the proper flourishing and functioning of human life. That's the purpose of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is an establishment of the second law to teach Israel how to live now that they have violated the covenant. They are no longer able to function as priests. The entire nation of Israel gets laicized, and in being laicized, they are now called to live covenant fidelity without the priesthood. And they are all called to live liturgical fidelity in obedience to the liturgical laws that God has put in place. So when you take a look at the book of Deuteronomy, what you are going to see is Moses giving them a first discourse, chapters 1 to 4. And then in the second discourse, he reiterates the Ten Commandments and new laws. And it's him just giving them so much. He talks about worship very specifically, chapters 12 to 27. He talks about the blessings for their obedience, but he also mentions this very explicitly. In fact, nowhere in the Torah does he mention it more specifically than Deuteronomy, the curses of disobedience. My brothers and sisters, we don't know this because we've lost it in the public sphere, but there was a point in America's history where the founding fathers had this as an established habit, even though they didn't write it down. And there was a point where this was practiced in the British Commonwealth as well. Whenever anyone was sworn into office, whether it was a public servant, or in our case in America, the president, any politician, a person taking the stand for testifying in court, judges, lawyers, policemen, firemen, anyone who is in a position of having authority over life and death over other people. Deuteronomy chapter 28 was opened up, and their hands were placed upon the word of God, and their other hand was placed like this. Why? Because God likes high fives? Absolutely not. It is because with one hand upon the heavens, well, I should be doing it this way, with one hand upon the heavens and with the other hand upon the word of God, specifically the blessings and curses for my obedience and disobedience, I swear to perform this duty that has been called upon me to the best of my abilities in obedience of the covenant laws, so help me God. Why? Because covenant fidelity is impossible without God's grace. It is completely humanly impossible if God does not help us do so. And that's why we say, so help me, God. Understanding this, think about the people who are swearing into office today. Our president, our politicians. I mean, I heard a story about 2 years ago that we have a local politician, not here in Michigan, but a local politician in America, who tried to swear her way in, and it was allowed, on a Dr. Seuss book. You're swearing yourself into a covenant, and we have lost sight of what a covenant is. We have to think very carefully about the people we elect into office. This is not just about political stipulations. It's not just about policies. There's a spiritual reality to this that we cannot fail to remember. We simply cannot afford to forget it. What Deuteronomy reminds us is that when someone swears into an office, their obedience to the covenant unleashes blessings upon them and the people they serve. And their disobedience to the covenant unleashes curses upon them and the people they serve. And I'll prove this to you. A doctor who swears the Hippocratic oath, and I say that knowing full well exactly what I just said. A doctor who swears the Hippocratic oath and who goes into service of others and who chooses to be disobedient to that order will wind up bringing harm to the life of their patients. The curse that's unleashed upon them is malpractice. The curse that's unleashed upon the patients can be death. A lawyer who breaks his oath of legal service, the curse that's upon him at the lowest level, he gets disbarred. The highest level, he gets thrown in prison. His client could potentially get thrown in prison for his misdeeds. The same is true of every person in every single aspect of service. The president who swears an oath to be father over the nation and who does not live up to the oath that he swears, if he is dishonest and disobedient to the covenant that he has undertaken, unleashes upon the entire nation the curses of the acts that he himself perpetrates. I mean, I'm not just talking rising gas prices here. I'm talking about full-blown civil turmoil. I'm talking about the dissolution of the model of the family and therefore the fabric of society as we know it, all in the purpose of pushing forth an agenda of popularity because this is the tidal wave that needs to be ridden right now. Make no mistake about it. When we put in place politicians who have no desire but to ride the tide of popularity, then to ride the tide of, in this case, wokeness and woke ideology, we are bringing about a dissolution of everything that not just America stands for, but the entire world stands for. Why? Because families are beyond the political sphere. Families are the first society of every single nation. The nuclear family, father, mother, and children, forms the bedrock of every single society, which forms the bedrock of every single nation, which forms the bedrock of the entire world. Get that wrong, destroy societies at a civil, national, and global level. And that's the problem that we have today. We are allowing people to be sworn into office because we like certain policies without stopping to think, gosh, the most important things are being cast away. That's why policies that don't adhere to the life of the most innocent and threatened, the weakest lives, ought to be the biggest red flags. Politicians who are not pro-life signal to everyone they don't care about vulnerable human life, and therefore don't expect them to care about your marriage and your family. Politicians who are pro-euthanasia and pro-assisted suicide, do not expect them to care about your dignity as a human person. None of this happens in a vacuum. All of this revolves around the fact that the human person is an integral person, and each human person makes up societies, and societies make up whole nations. Deuteronomy is built around that premise. So when you and I read the book of Deuteronomy, think of America. Think of your nation as you're listening to this. Think of your families. And ask yourself, am I living obediently to the covenant that I have willingly entered into? My baptismal promises, am I upholding them? Should I renew my covenant again? Should I run to confession? And then lift our families up. Raise them to be faithful to the covenant. Let these words be upon their minds and on their hands and in their hearts. First and foremost, we are children of the covenant of God our Father, and that is the only thing that we will be able to take with us when we leave this life. How faithfully have we lived in love of God, and from there of neighbor. God calls us to the standard of living as His own children. Make no mistake about it. That is an expectation upon you and upon me, upon every one of us who professes the name of God in covenant fidelity. When you open the book of Deuteronomy, see in it the words of a loving father figure, Moses, chiding you and me to be better children of the covenant. And then let's ask ourselves, what are the areas in my life where I am disobedient to the covenant? Now is the time to let the grace of God purify me, that I may live lives worthy of the call that's been placed upon me, and upon my marriage, and upon my family. Until next time, God bless you and keep you always. I'm Marcus Peter.